Chapter 1. Where did I go wrong? My 30th birthday was a major bummer. Major. It's not just that I was turning 30. In fact, most of my decade birthdays haven't bugged me too much. The 5s, 25 and 35, were harder for me. There's something about being on the downward slope toward the next decade that, in my opinion, is worse than actually getting there. But 30 was a drag for a number of reasons. First, my dad had cancer. He'd been diagnosed about 5 months prior and had just finished his last round of chemo. He looked old and sick, and it was hard for me to look at him without breaking down. His skin was waxy, his voice weak and scratchy, and his bald head a signal to the world that all was not well. Seeing my dad so sick infused a lot of grief into a day that should have been hopeful and fun. Second, I spent my 30th birthday at my uncle's funeral. 7 days earlier, he'd been walking with my aunt through the airport, ready to board a flight to attend his grandson's high school graduation. Within seconds, he was on the floor of Concourse F, dead from a massive heart attack. Our family piled into cars and caravanned more than an hour's drive to a crowded country church to celebrate his life, grieve his departure, and comfort his wife and children. At this point, my birthday was no longer about me, and rightly so. But I think my family felt sorry for me because after the funeral, we went back to my sister's place and had an impromptu barbecue. I was given cards and gifts and everyone wished me well. My dad went upstairs for a nap. It was all pretty low-key, which I guess is to be expected when you're turning 30 and sharing the day with a funeral. As if this weren't enough to establish the day as one of the top 10 most dismal birthdays of all time, something else sticks out about it. It's the day I realized I was single. Okay, I knew I was single before that day, of course, but I'd never really noticed. And I certainly hadn't cared, not really anyway. But that day was different. It was the day life caught up with me, unceremoniously tapped me on the shoulder and grabbed my attention. I remember it so clearly, sitting on the sofa at my parents' house with a cup of coffee, silently wishing myself a happy birthday. And then it popped into my head. I'm 30 and single. This isn't where I thought I'd be. This isn't the story I wanted or expected. What happened? I wasn't dating anyone. I wasn't even close to dating anyone. I had a good job, but I wasn't curing cancer, starting orphanages, or sharing the gospel with unreached people groups. My job wasn't something that defined me, and I certainly wasn't too attached to it. My life was good, but it wasn't great. More accurately, it wasn't what I'd scripted for myself back when I thought life could be scripted. On that day, I realized that during the past 10 years, I'd abandoned the script and let myself drift. I dropped the reins and entered a desert, personally, professionally, and to some extent, spiritually. So there I was at 30, having a pre-midlife crisis. I thought by that age I'd be married. I thought I'd be fulfilling some kind of rockin' callin' with a hopelessly devoted, incredibly hot, and financially secure husband who also happened to be ridiculously godly. Instead, I was an aging singleton with a sick dad, a dead uncle, and some serious questions about how I'd gotten there. Where had I gone wrong? I'd like to blame my childhood. I always assumed I'd get married. Even in 6th grade, I had relationship potential. It was the 1980s, and Tony, the school's best breakdancer, liked me. He was a big Filipino guy who held court outside in our school's commons, ghetto blaster by his side and broken down refrigerator box at his feet to serve as his dance floor. He breakdanced during recess as just about every kid in the school watched in awe. He was revered, at least as far as middle school breakdancers go. One day, after an especially impressive show, he sauntered up to me in his parachute pants and members-only jacket, nervously pulled a huge plastic comb from his pocket, swiped it through his gelled hair, and quietly asked me right then and there to be his girlfriend. I smiled and said, no. It's not that I was trying to be mean. Even though I was pretty popular at school, I was generally kind. My rejecting Tony wasn't as much about him in particular as it was about him in general. You see, I was an honors student. I played first chair flute in the band. I soloed in the choir. I had almost won the area spelling bee. Should a sixth grader really be expected to spell lieutenant? Apparently so. Basically, what I'm saying is, I had standards. I was aiming higher than being the girlfriend of a breakdancer. Then came Chad. Chad was everything Tony wasn't. Chad was a preppy kid from a rich family who was, in essence, John F. Kennedy Jr. His skin was tanned year-round and he wore corduroy short shorts and Sperry-top ciders. The collars of his Izod shirts were always crisply turned up. Chad was cute, smart, rich, and funny. Ba-bam! Chad walked up to me one day after class and said hello. I said hello back. He proceeded to look at his shoes and start muttering. I said, what? He kept muttering. I said, what? Again. He looked up at me, his face red. He pushed his bangs, the bangs that flopped perfectly over his right eye, away from his face and blurted out, "You're the smartest girl I ever met. Will you be my girlfriend?" I smiled and said, "No." Chad was a cool guy, but I felt there was something missing, you know? It pained me to let him down, as much as a sixth grade girl with a sense of relationship entitlement could be pained. But it had to be done. He just wasn't everything I was looking for. Neither was Gary, who bought me 25 carnation grams during our school's Valentine Day fundraiser and wrote separate notes for each one. Or Rich, who painted me a picture in art class. Or Kevin, who said a bunch of mean things about me, then later admitted it was because he was trying to get my attention. Or James, or Jason, or Sean, Michael, or Ben. All of these boys were nice, but none of them were enough. As you can see, my dating prospects were pretty good in the sixth grade. They've been on a downward spiral ever since. I guess I didn't know what I had when I had it. My mom, of course, doesn't understand this. I'm the youngest of 6 kids, and my mom was 42 when I was born. This was back when having kids at 42 wasn't cool. It certainly wasn't safe, and my mom reminds me of this often. As it is, we have a huge generation gap between us. She's now 86 years old and can't for her life figure out why I'm still single. My mom's story is something you'd expect from someone who got married in the 1950s. She met my dad in college, stalked him at a few basketball games, went to a senior banquet, and he popped the question. They got married, started out dirt poor, built a life together, started having kids, became dirt poor again, and before they knew it, they had 50 years together. I don't know why it's so difficult for you, she tells me with a frown. When I met your dad, I just knew. Of course, she conveniently omits the fact that my dad wouldn't even date her at first. She was from Connecticut. He was from a small farm town in northern Minnesota. She arrived as the new girl on their Chicago campus with her powdered face, red lips, and kitten heels. My dad was convinced she was unsaved and didn't give her a second look except to hope that she would attend the next citywide revival and meet the Lord. Her friend did the requisite reconnaissance to determine my dad's misgivings, and within a week my mom was makeup-free and looking substantially more spiritual and demure. With that minor issue resolved, her road to the altar was blissfully unencumbered. I, on the other hand, have a different story. Sixth grade conquests notwithstanding, my dating history has had more downs than ups. Okay, if I'm being honest, it's not really the ups or downs, but the dry, desolate, winding desert highways that crisscross my dating atlas. It's not that I didn't want to get married. As I said in the beginning, I always assumed I would. It's more that I didn't even think about it. It wasn't on my radar. Mind you, I grew up in a home that modeled a good marriage. As a child, I played house. I pushed my dolls in their stroller and read them bedtime stories. I bullied the neighbor boy into marrying me many times and personally superintended countless weddings between Barbie and Ken before they drove off in their Corvette, belonging to the neighbor girls. My parents would never have caved into buying something so ridiculous when there are still people in the world without Bibles. Toward happily ever after. I saw good marriages at church and within my extended family. I went to youth group, youth conferences, and family camp. I fell in love with every male camp counselor I met. But after rejecting all my potential boyfriends in 6th grade and fixing my eyes instead on attending Yale University, I became jaded. I'll never forget a certain day in 8th grade. It was occupation day at school, and we were supposed to dress as what we wanted to be when we grew up. I can't even remember what I wore. But boy, do I remember my friend Lori's costume. Lori was the eldest of 7 children in a Mormon family. She lived in our neighborhood a few doors down from me, was one of my best friends, and was pretty much the sweetest girl on the planet. She walked into school that day dressed in a wedding gown. The class burst into laughter, and I was embarrassed for her. I was also embarrassed by her. Her biggest aspiration was to be a bride? A wife? Maybe even a mom? Poor thing. I look back on that day with a fair measure of regret. How sad that I not only didn't esteem marriage, but I mocked the girl who did.